Well, for more on what's next for Libya, I'm now joined by James Denselow, a London-based writer on Middle East politics and security issues. James, thank you very much for being here with us in the program. Now, British and French leaders are heading to Tripoli, as we know, to congratulate the new government, the first foreign heads of state to visit since the overthrow of Gaddafi. So what is the significance of this visit?
Well, I think it's a real valediction to the legitimacy of the new leadership. Ultimately, the Americans sent an Assistant Secretary of State yesterday to Tripoli, and now you have some of the allies who were responsible for leading the NATO air campaign that ultimately was largely responsible for the victory of the rebels themselves. So it's a real moment, and ultimately it occurs at a time where fighting is still ongoing in parts of the country, in Bani Walid and Sirte in particular, but ultimately it'll give the rebel authorities, who are now the government authorities, let's not forget, a real diplomatic boost.
Well, we're hearing of a number of human rights abuses there on the ground, and especially the African Union alleges rebels have been killing black Africans in Libya, and also from Amnesty International hearing that some war crimes accusations. Also, our correspondent told us that some people there are afraid to speak out and talk to our correspondent. So what's happening on the ground there?
Well, it's interesting, the Amnesty report talks about uncertainty and fear across Libya. I would argue that prior to Gaddafi's fall, you had a certainty of fear. However, that doesn't mean that the situation there now is tolerable. Clearly, there are real problems on the ground. I think there's a legacy of such a conflict that you will have human rights abuses taking part on both sides. I think the rebels, the National Transitional Council, have promised to hold their own fighters to account, and I think that is a process that we will see from now. However, on the other side of the coin, we have seen some horrific mass graves and some sort of very quick executions, it seems, on Gaddafi's part as he retreated. So clearly, once the fog of war lifts, we will be really left to see the true impact of this war on the people of Libya.
Now, will rebels continue to mount attacks on Gaddafi strongholds, but civilians are there too. So why is NATO quick to condemn Gaddafi's assault on Benghazi, apparently turning a blind eye?
I don't know if they're turning a blind eye. I think ultimately, if you look at the assaults on the Gaddafi-held areas post the fall of Tripoli, there's been a lot of delays, a lot of waiting, a lot of offering ceasefires and peace offerings and saying, listen, why not surrender? Gaddafi's gone. That hasn't seemed to have been taken up at the moment, and therefore the rebels seem to be now moving in. NATO, on the other hand, has always professed to use highly targeted weapons as best as they work, and has often actually not used airstrikes if they are in civilian areas. So I think that NATO are still very careful to civilian casualties, and in the case of Bani Walid, a lot of the civilian population of the town, those who are not being held hostage by the Gaddafi forces, are leaving. So hopefully there will not be large-scale civilian casualties there.
Well, the U.S. says it's working with rebels to find conventional weapons apparently missing from Gaddafi's arms depot. So how much of a risk is there that they could end up in the wrong hands?
I think it's a really important question. It's a really dangerous scenario. It's similar to what happened in Iraq in the fall of Baghdad. A very weaponized society, people with automatic weapons in their homes, as well as the looting of large-scale military-grade munitions, RPGs, mortars, and even materials and components of potential chemical weapons. This is a very dangerous scenario considering the numbers of groups operating in Libya at present and the fluid nature of the situation. So I believe that the Transitional National Council, their first job is, of course, to finish off the fighting in the areas that are still holding out pro-Gaddafi. Their second job is to give themselves legitimacy by getting the electoral cycle undergo. And the third job really is to prevent weapons proliferation across the country, and that's a very difficult job.
Well, and briefly, does NATO consider the consequences of supplying rebel groups with weapons?
I think the weapon supplies were minimal. I think if you look at the French and the British, it was small arms, it was sort of support for civilian control in areas they'd captured. The biggest NATO support was clearly air power, and the fact that a large percentage of Gaddafi's military was destroyed from the air. So I think ultimately there will be a rebuilding of the Libyan security forces following the end of this civil war, and ultimately NATO will be involved in that. But at present, I feel that the rebels are under their own steam to a certain extent with NATO air power.
Okay, James Denselow, London-based writer on Middle East politics and security issues. Thank you very much for being here with us.